Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us for our PsyTech Investor Roundtable. We love hosting all of you and look forward to this interesting discussion. What a panel. We are lucky to have Matthew Anderson, CEO of Vanguard Scientific, a leader in the extraction industry for plant-based products. Matt is an entrepreneur, pioneer and steward of conscious capital investing. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us tonight, and I will hand this discussion over to you to get started.
Hey, thanks a lot, Deb. And thank you, PsyTech, for creating this space. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is definitely a global event from the attendees that are showing up. And what a cool topic. This is the first Psychedelics roundtable that I've hosted in this space. As Deb mentioned, I spent the past 6 years of my life primarily in cannabis and botanical extractions for supplements in the medicinal space. Investing as an entrepreneur, as also as running Vanguard Scientific, as mentioned. This conversation is something that's really special in the fact that it's a roundtable. This isn't meant to be a presented formal engagement, but more along the lines of the opportunity for me to create conversation to let these really special people in this industry talk at a very early time. To many of you, a lot of these names that are in front of you don't need introduction. And then, to be honest, to prevent myself from stumbling over their introductions, I'm going to go around our roundtable panel and just give everybody a chance to kind of give you an understanding of their perspective, their role in the space. And as we go through the questions, I think it's going to add a lot of color. So ladies first, Anna Soren. Anna, you're the Director of New Listings at the Canadian Securities Exchange. Tell us a little bit about your background, yourself, and the exchange.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much for having me, first of all. Yes, so I am Director of Listings Development with the Canadian Securities Exchange. For those of you that might not know about us, we are a Canadian stock exchange. We are mainly in the small cap space. But with the emerging markets, we've actually entered, senior issuer status. And just, based on what we saw in the cannabis space, we have over 620 companies, I should know the exact number in the cannabis space, but I think it's around 200 in the cannabis space. And so we really have become the leading force for these emerging markets to come. I did an event in June, and I was telling in our pre-chat, I did an event in June. We had 3 companies focused in the psychedelic space. And already now by December, we have over 30, and I know there's lots in the queue. So the CSE is going to be home to a lot of the psychedelic focused issuers that you're going to see come to market.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anna. Really enjoyed our pre-chat, and I'm looking forward to what you've got to tell the listeners today. Stephen Murphy, congratulations on the new child, first off. Again, your name doesn't need much to precede you from the previous industry that you were in, but co-founder of Psych, powered by Prohibition Partners and much more. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you're doing at Psych.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Again, thanks to PsyTech for hosting and putting on what is very relevant and certainly timely challenges. We've seen momentum shift from investor appetite from cannabis to psychedelics in the last few weeks. So looking forward to the hour ahead. So my name is Stephen Murphy. We launched Psych earlier this year, really just as kind of a natural evolution of what we have been working on within the plant-based medicine industry. So trying to provide insights and intelligence and a little bit of clarity to investors, operators, and regulators within the space. I think we had been looking at the industry for around 2 years, but obviously, was a little hesitant to get involved because of our association and focus with cannabis, and also because we ourselves needed to learn more about what the industry was, needed to learn more about the medicines themselves, and needed to understand, what we would be doing if we were to kind of provide an offering within it. But we launched earlier this year and kind of have been working primarily with investors and operators, both from the existing industry, but also, from traditional pharma sectors and life science sectors who have been transitioning into psychedelics and wanting to understand the market in depth. I think it's, it is such a a fascinating subject that we ourselves are scratching the surface as to, what the future holds, but also, going down different rabbit holes in the psychedelic world, because it's when you try and compare, the market with cannabis, it doesn't really work. It's kind of like, say, it's kind of having 7 different cannabis markets under the psychedelics umbrella. It's much more complex, and I think for us that is certainly one of the benefits of what we offer in relation to a data intelligence offering, but it's also one of the more interesting things to look forward to when you wake up every morning.
We're gonna get into a lot of what you said during the presentation today, but I do appreciate the fact that you haven't come out as Psych and saying, "Look, we've got a crystal ball. We knew what happened in cannabis, so we know what's going to happen over here." I think that humility probably comes across this entire panel, but specifically to what you guys are doing there. Haim, your background is diverse, med tech, bio. We now have a relationship that we've built in cannabis and continue to extend here into psychedelics. Talk a little bit about yourself as well as what you're doing at PsyTech, please.
Sure, I'll be very brief because I'm looking forward to the questions you prepared, Matthew, and the discussion with the folks around this virtual roundtable. My background is 22 years in biotechnology, business development, business building, and image-guided surgery, digital radiology, and this is since the late 90s. So very much emerging technologies and in emerging markets. I spent 9 years in infectious disease diagnostics and big data in Africa and Canada, Europe, and Israel, where I'm actually calling in from now. It was about 2.5 years ago that a close colleague in the cannabis space told me about what the future was going to hold for psychedelic therapeutics. So he and I wound up formulating. He was really the core formulator of what PsyTech would become. In February, I took the helm as CEO, and we've really focused PsyTech on mainstreaming the medicinal use of psychedelics, mainstreaming psychedelic therapies. And that takes the form of PsyTech Connect, of which our summits and this webinar is a part. It also takes the form, which many folks may not be aware, as this is just coming out into the media recently. It also takes the form of the direct delivery of care via integrated mental health clinics in the United States, as well as the clinical tools to enable mainstream mental health care providers to integrate psychedelic assisted therapy in the fullness of time. And that's a software suite that I'm happy to discuss later, but that's PsyTech in a nutshell.
It's not an easy thing to do because you've got multiple efforts and holdings to put it into an elevator. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I need a tall building and a slow elevator. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, Elon Linton, some might say, as he's going to space and building the rocket ship too. You may proceed yourself, sir. The work you've done in cannabis and prior have built an incredible stage, and I mean that in the most sincere way. For a lot of the thoughts that you're putting forward, you're the director of MindMed, and I know a lot of people here are interested in learning a little bit more about yourself and specifically what you're doing with MindMed in the industry.
Yeah, I've got a couple things. So MindMed and Red Light Holland, and now some clinics that we're trying to make virtually available, meaning you don't need real estate. But maybe to preface why I'm involved, I was involved in cannabis not because I wanted you to buy it or not buy it, didn't care. What I wanted you to do was think. And I wanted you to think about if you had a bias, why you had a bias, where it came from, and whether or not once you began thinking, you still had the same view. I saw that as a ongoing opportunity here, and I thought that the opportunity really was kind of like, how do we follow the rules and change the rules based on public perception? How do we use science to create IP? And then, you start creating a different asset class. And the effect of that is you create a different industry. And the result should be very positive for people, but it starts by making them think, following rules, being IP oriented, and really having a long term, right? I enjoyed when people wanted to call it pot, and I was interested in discussing cannabinoid therapy. So those can be the same thing, but it's a very different dialogue. And I think dialogue's happening more rapidly here. There's been some questions. I think there is an awesome adoption curve for large capital institutional who want to look at this much more actively than they did pot. But the cannabis world right now, they don't know much about other than a couple of the molecules and what they can do with them. And so there's a long tail of research there. I think we start with a long tail here, and people should look at it that way and expect, unless you're like Red Light Holland, which is trying to govern for short-term revenue, packaging, responsibility, follow the rules, recreational, there's a long tail of research. And so I think we should have a good discussion, but the simple reality is this is not going to be quick and it's not going to be cheap, but it's definitely worth doing.
Thanks, and that's more stage setting than could be imagined, and there's really good points there. So let's go ahead and jump in. Bruce, what you talked about there in the Red Light Holland near-term revenue model and this long-term, long-tail intellectual property strategy, is a reality of this space that really was kind of either missed or not nurtured in the cannabis space. As this is an investment roundtable, people are coming into this market, whether they're looking to invest publicly through the Canadian Securities Exchange or looking to invest privately. I'm really interested in kind of getting the panel's opinion, and we can go around the room on getting some of the hallmarks of things they're seeing in strong investment opportunities. Bruce, you mentioned intellectual property, and I've had pre-conversations with each of you. Anna, I understand that you, as kind of Switzerland here, representing the exchange, don't actually do valuation efforts, but you do see a lot of deals. I think you have 30 psychedelic deals at this point on the exchange. So that's an incredible perspective. Let's see, who would like to start? Things that look at business. Bruce, yeah, jump in here.
What was the big news we woke up to this morning? In the cannabis sort of broad world was that Tilray was essentially being eaten by Aphria. And if you said, well, why would they do that? It's because the research European medical science part of Tilray has advanced enough to be novel and have a potentially serious long-term value versus talking about a party and plants. And so I think that we're going to continue to see validation that should be applied to how we perceive the opportunity in this space of orientation towards research, intellectual property, really, evolving the molecules, creating arcs of many things together. But the reward is going to be, in cannabis and here, often handed out to those that pursue science for truly novel outcomes. Truly, I get this. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to pivot off your point, Bruce. When I first was getting acquainted with this space, which was gripping, if you're intellectually honest and you look at the research, it's just incredibly compelling. Unless you have Nancy Reagan's voice rattling around in your head, if you're my age, you can't not look at this research and realize that all those superlatives that are thrown around so casually in tech actually apply here. Breakthrough, paradigm shifting, all of that is true. And certainly psychedelics are driving down a road that cannabis paved in the sense of destigmatization, both being egregious victims of an ill-conceived war on drugs. But the difference is, and Bruce just alluded to this, the difference is important to recognize. This is not a market driven by recreational or non-prescription users agitating for a change to stupid laws. This market is driven by incredibly compelling clinical data coming out of unimpeachable medical institutions, regardless of how many of us may use different classes of psychedelics. That's what's driving this market. So that one comment, number one. Comment number two, in terms of what to look for in terms of quality investments in the space, which we take to mean, I want to define what that means. A quality investment, to my mind, and I hope to everybody, many people listening, and I know to most of, and I know to everybody at this roundtable, a quality investment isn't defined as a quick return on your money. That's not what we mean by quality investment here. Not transactional, not who's going to be putting out the best press release to raise the shares so that I can sell out rather quickly. Rather, who's going to be a winner in the long game that was just alluded to in Bruce's comments. And the winners of that long game, I believe, are going to be people who are conceiving of this market as the mainstreaming of psychedelic therapeutics, not 12 months from now, but 36, 48, 52 months from now. As legal reforms inevitably come, as all the phase 3 trials wind up liberating these therapies for wide use. And if that's the case, now you return to the laws of physics of business, which absolutely apply to this sector as well as any other, which is quality management, a quality business model, a management team that has relevant experience, and I believe a focus on not just the ketamine clinics in the United States or retreat centers, a couple hundred maybe at the most, but people focused on mainstream psychologists, psychiatrists, and eventually wellness consumers, but the clinical users of these remarkable therapies.
Well said. Well said. Stephen.
Like the point Bruce made there around what companies, you know, where the value is around IP and companies creating unique value propositions. It's obviously important, but I still think we're a good bit away from actually those investors or the investment community, and certainly the market in general, actually knowing what IP it is looking for and what IP is a value. It is, you know, 33 companies on, was it 33 companies on the CSE alone? You know, what do we actually know of that IP and what sort of research has been done? I think there's been obviously a rush of getting listed and a rush of getting companies, but it's IP, of course, is core and it's important, but it's not. I don't think we're as investors that savvy as to what the IP landscape looks like and what IP is of value within the space yet. Like, you know, we've got companies like Compass that claim to have or have IP that, you know, if you do other research on it, is comparable to other companies on the market that don't share the same market cap or don't share, you know, the same valuation and are a lot more accessible. So IP is of course is a winner, but I think we as an investor base or as an industry are maybe not as informed as we could be around what IP is important.
I think that's a totally justifiable point. And I think that from our pre-con, you've got a lot to say about value in a pre-revenue marketplace. And I think the junior markets and what you're going to have to share here is important.
Well, you know, here's the thing, and people need to remember this, which is really important, is the markets are secondary market. They have nothing to do with how many units of something that you sell. They have to do with investor sentiment. And I think what we finally had happen in the cannabis space is we finally had the next generation come to the stock market. I know more people, you know, in their 20s that buy condos than they put, you know, $5,000 into the stock market. So I think it really did attract that next generation. And now they have the ability, like never before in the history of time, to trade on their computers, on their phones. You know, the commissions are $9 or they're free down in the US. And so the opportunity to invest has finally never been easier. Cannabis was kind of that barrier to entry for them. And I think some people, a decent amount of people, made a lot of money in the cannabis space. And so now they were hungry for the next thing. So I think the one thing to remember about the psychedelic space, it has been around forever. I did lots of interviews when I did my Investing in Psychedelic Forum, and most of the people I spoke with have been in that sector for 20, 30, 40 years. So this is not new, and the research being done on it is not new, and its applications aren't new. But what is new is the retail market is demanding that it comes to the capital market. So that's a really neat opportunity. It will help progress the space. This kind of capital going into any kind of sector will help move things forward. But as you mentioned, the valuation, people need to have some form of due diligence. You know, you can be buying a stock because it's a really great company. It has really great fundamentals. It has a great track record and great management. Or most people are probably out there buying it because psychedelics are hot and there's lots of liquidity and there's lots going on in the markets. You know, whatever your choice is, you need to be aware of why you're buying it. And you need to have a due diligence process when you're looking at these. I think everyone's struggling with valuations right now. I've spoken with brokers who have raised lots of money for some of these deals, and you know, they're struggling. Valuators are struggling. So as we move along, and that's where the speculation comes into this market mainly, is we don't know in 5 years what's going to be the important element. You know, when cannabis started, we didn't know that MSOs would be the big thing in the US, right? So this is all going to flesh out, and there's going to be some winners and some not winners. But that's the potential upside for investors. The only other thing I want to touch on, and it's important to remind people of this, the opportunity in the capital markets is that we've created some corporate governance structure around these companies that they have to disclose a bunch of information. So if you want to invest in a company, the information's all there. Their financials are there, their prospectus is there, everything is available online. And I really encourage people to take the time to, you know, a lot of it's hard for most of us to understand. It's legal jumbo, but take the time to look through it. It's all available to you.
I think the one of the big arcs to pick up here on the conversation and the opportunity we've got with this panel is to look at the past life, right? The cannabis industry that we've all just come through in different shapes and forms. What are the lessons learned, and how are they being applied in what you're doing today? Bruce, you were the captain, the largest entity in the space. You created it and guided it. You know, now you are across a number of different activities in this space, but I'm sure in many ways everyone's looking to you to kind of see through the crystal ball. What are some of the lessons learned that you're applying here in this industry?
Well, I would say the first thing is, there was a good comment on the sidebar. We are just the people right now with the baton in our hand running right now, but we've been handed it by a number of people who did much work prior. And so I think we need to be meaningfully thoughtful of that. And so there was a comment about AIDS community. The only federally recognized group that supported tweed in the early days, like, I mean, the Minister of Health would not speak to us, but was the AIDS Association. And they, in fact, sometimes carried messages on our behalf to try and get the Minister of Health. And the only time I was able to corner the Minister of Health to talk about a policy error they'd made was at a fundraiser for the AIDS Society. So we need to think about who got us here and be thoughtful and considerate. Second thing is, there are so many, everybody will say, well, the evaluation of 100 million or 500 million or billion it's completely wrong. Listen, they might be right and they might be wrong, but I know that I had kept some emails from an individual who told me I should quickly sell all of my stock because our valuation at Tweed went over 100 million, and it was such an impossible thought that a plant which was ready available anywhere could ever create a company worth anything. I think that person was wrong. So we're going to do what we're going to do. And maybe the final thing I would take that's a parallel from the cannabis space is there will be ways that you don't follow the rules and you make money. And I know the MSO model. I'm involved with a single state operator in the US, and I was reluctant for a number of years to do that, but it turns out not following federal rules isn't a big deal. I thought it was. But I think that in this space, there are a number of jurisdictions, and I don't care if you talk about Netherlands to Brazil, Jamaica to Canada, there are jurisdictions which will govern what we do and allow us to do it fully legally. And so I think much of what we do, we'll probably want to have a number of actors who really keep that in mind, because it does curry favor. And so it is a balancing act. Can we get it done in those jurisdictions that permit it? No. Okay, is there any jurisdiction on the planet that does permit it? Switzerland pops up a lot. And so I think this is going to be a global thing just because of the governance model.
Really interesting insights. Again, from the cockpit, that's great intelligence for everybody listening. Thank you for that value. Haim, again, you were directly involved in Canna, and then you come from past life in research and immunology, as you mentioned. Any past life lessons learned that you're applying here that the investors and listeners can benefit from is helpful.
I'm still trying to integrate lessons learned. I'm only 46 years old, so it's going to take me many more years to integrate them. But I would simply say this: this is a medically driven market, in the sense that the medicinal uses, I believe, is what's going to drive real long-term value in the space initially. Then I think health and wellness uses. So say where the prescriptions and the dosages are going to be radically different, enabling people to use these molecules in other ways. The microdosing revolution the research behind that is going to follow the macrodosing therapeutics that are driving a lot of the companies today, whether they're working on pharma, whether they're working on software, clinical tools, or whether they're working on the actual clinics themselves. And then I think a distant third, and only in some jurisdictions, will be the recreational. That's as far as any crystal ball I have can take me. And I think that is a substantial difference from what I participated in, what I saw in the cannabis space, in which all three were happening simultaneously, and the economic drivers behind them were substantially different. I think psychedelics, because of incredible healing capacity, are going to be it's those three real prescription medicinal use, health and wellness, then recreational. They're going to arrive in a succession.
Could you put them in? Is that the succession? Is that the sequence?
Absolutely. The medical prescription uses first, in the doses that any regulator would be concerned with people consuming at home on their own. If you look at the number of trials going on around the world right now, again, by top shelf institutions whose reputations matter, are producing such incredible therapeutic results in a time when we have epidemic levels of mental health pathologies, mental health crises across the board. The American numbers are a parallel for every place else that I've ever been or worked, including Africa, where the numbers aren't tracked particularly well in some countries, and where they parallel the United States, Canada, everybody else. In the last 20 years, even though we've had the advent of potent psychoactive prescriptive medicines, you still see the rates of depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, suicide occurring. And because of that, like, you just think about the timing here. You have epidemic proportions. It's just not transmissible by a bug or a virus person to person. But if you look at the numbers, it's an epidemic. It's getting worse. God knows what COVID did to those numbers. You have breakthrough therapeutics for exactly those mental health issues: depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD, etc. And you have the finest institutions creating the data that's driven regulators to fast track a lot of these things. Of course, the medicinal use is going to come first in that environment. And and I also think the medicinal uses, there's a hesitance for the people involved in that to talk about recreation. Again, regardless of what they do in their personal lives, what any of us do, They don't want to talk about recreation because they don't dare want to disturb the medicinal path when we're dealing with such breakthroughs at a time when they're so desperately needed. And in business terms, when the market is, when there's a great need, I'll put it that way.
Right. No, yeah, that's exactly what
I hope that was clear.
It's really valuable. No, it is important. And when you look at so many opportunities and you aren't a sophisticated investor, I need to know where I should put my money at what time, right? So that sequencing helps, and I appreciate it. Stephen, you've got a lot of lessons that you could share with us. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've probably, well, lessons. I've probably kind of three main observations. The first is kind of mirroring back to what Bruce said in relation to jurisdictions. You know, the treatment that we're talking about is very specialist and very, you know, it's for the majority of conditions, the treatment can be done in a short period of time, and you know, with not a high level of frequency. So patients will travel in the early days for treatment. And I think, you know, we've seen entrepreneuring nations and entrepreneuring locations such as St. Vincent's and the Grenadines, you know, opening up themselves to psychedelics and psychedelics investments. Now, who doesn't want to go to the Caribbean for psychedelic treatment? It's going to definitely have a competitive advantage in terms of attracting not only investment, but, you know, as being a destination for that type of healthcare. When we think of top level healthcare in the world, we all think of this, the Alps or the mountains in Switzerland for pristine retreats. I think we're going to see some of that pop up with jurisdictions who have kind of acknowledged the medical advances and the medical potential of psychedelics. The second bit that I think we are, or the psychedelics is more advanced in, is the infrastructure. Like in cannabis, there was the need to build all of these facilities. Maybe not as many facilities that were built, but there was definitely the need to build all of these facilities. And you know, the capex required for all of this was astronomical. Whereas with psychedelics, I think the capex is being used in a more focused way, be it on clinical trials, be it on product development. And that is, you know, we're looking more at patient access. You're seeing education platforms, you're seeing clinics, you're seeing I suppose tracking methodology and tracking formats and tracking technology appear more so, you know, it's at phase one or phase two of the industry, whereas in cannabis, they were still so focused on production and extraction and the initial phase that I think it's a little bit beneficial to psychedelics that it's not as reliant on, you know, that heavy set infrastructure. And then third, of course, is in cannabis, you had the one plant and, you know, trying to cover 50, 60 different conditions. And it was the same strain trying to cover all of these conditions. Whereas with psychedelics, nobody's trying to do PTSD and addiction treatment and depression. You're very focused with the products and you're very focused with the condition. And I think that is definitely why, you know, we've seen maybe 33 or 30 companies, you know, go on the CSE, is because you've got individualism and you've got very focused avenues in terms of what it is you're looking to develop. And you're not trying to conquer all. You know, when you go in, when you talk about cannabis and you say, oh, look, cannabis can be an appetite suppressant and it can be an appetite stimulant and it can, you know, it can help with spasticity and X, Y, and Z. It sounds too good to be true. And, you know, it takes longer trying to explain this to doctors to come on board. Whereas with psychedelics, that individual focus allows for a greater body of evidence to be gathered, and, you know, is obviously better for the patient at the end of the day.
I think your pivot there for observations versus lessons learned are super relevant, Stephen. But I'm going to save a lot of comments until the next question, but thanks for that insight. Anna, observations or lessons learned from your time in cannabis and the CSC overall, and now the time you've spent with the companies that you've been able to review during the listing process?
Well, I'll clarify, I don't review the listings, so I don't want people calling me, telling me to put their file at the top. I can't do it. I think one of the big things in the cannabis space that we learned is that just because you can raise money doesn't mean you should. So when you're looking at these companies, if they're raising a lot, and I've already seen some raises. I mean, there's some amazing capital raising that's happening. I love when companies are raising capital because as an investor, you're putting money directly into the company, which is a unique opportunity. So I love seeing the capital raises that are happening. And I love that capital is going to further these companies, whatever their initiative is. But it doesn't always mean that they should. Just because you can raise, 50 million doesn't mean that you need 50 million or you should. And it creates a bit of a house of cards with some of these companies. And I think that's what we learned from the cannabis space is there was some money that was being raised that didn't need to be raised. It was over, diluting shareholders in the capital structure. And when they had to go back to market, which they all did in the end, have to go back to market and raise more, capital, it didn't provide that foundation for growth and upside for shareholders. So I think that's one really important thing that we learned from the cannabis space is, take a look at what these companies are doing. What is their use of proceeds? As well, I think it's important. My mom moved to Bulgaria when I was 18. And so I went to visit her and they had just fallen out of communism. So everyone finally had the ability to drive a car. And so it was an entire country of new drivers. And that's kind of what the cannabis space felt like for a moment was, an entire capital markets of new drivers. We had new investors coming to the table who didn't have experience. And we had people coming to market who might have known cannabis very well, but didn't know the capital markets. And, Bruce is a good example of somebody who has that kind of dual understanding. And, that's when they talk about good management, you need to make sure that the people that are out there know how to run a public company and also have experts on the sideline that are in there. The other thing I do have to say, because I think it's really important to note is cannabis and psychedelics are not, they're apples and oranges as far as I'm concerned. Yes, they both will make somebody high. And yes, the capital markets really likes, them right now. But otherwise, their applications, the research and development, the IP, the goal of getting, kind of that IP in the next strain and getting the right mix, all of those things are done very differently. I don't think it'll be the same. Just because there isn't going to be that same recreational market, at least not, in the next 5 years, we're not going to see that. So they are very different, but it's really important to make sure that you're taking a look at what the company is doing, the management team, how much they're raising, what they're raising it for.
Yeah, the use of proceeds is crucial. When I've been looking at the at the files that have come across my desk, that's one of the things you look at immediately after. What's the mission, who's driving that mission, and how much they're raising. Is there a good and credible use of funds immediately? And it's an easy test if it's somebody taking advantage of a hot market or somebody who's really intent to build something.
Well, if a company raises 10 million and it spends 2 million on a 3-day promotion, it's probably a house of cards. I'm gonna get it.
Yeah, that's a good one. For sure. Yeah.
Take a look.
20% on promotion.
So past use of proceeds, these are majority pre-revenue companies. Anna, you're absolutely right. Cannabis is different than psychedelics. Psychedelics is an umbrella, right? So we've got ketamine and MDMA and ibogaine and ayahuasca and all the others, and psilocybin. From an investor's lens, I think what we're hearing is a lot of different things, right? There is an adult use or therapeutics market. It's going to develop behind medicinal. There's strong intellectual properties that are going to be the cornerstones of real value. But there's large sums of money that need to be brought in and to be able to execute these varying strategies. From an investor's perspective, looking at businesses that are pre-revenue, how do you balance that? Bruce, let's go back to you. I know you're in the midst of this. How do you guys look at building a company that can turn cash either today or within some time frame of investor return while you pursue these longer tail development aspects of a business?
So I would say a lot of investors want to hear, what is the downside protection? So what that actually means is, will you be wrong? And what's the probability of being wrong? And what are you doing to mitigate if you're wrong? And so one of the things that always struck me in this space is, and it started off when I began discussing the business model with the folks from MindMed, is I said, you seem extraordinarily smart. You seem to be able to speak all day long about the evolutionary path you've attempted to take a molecule on and why you think you're at the right place. But what if you're wrong? So why don't we build an ark, like a big ship? And on the ark, have some common services which would enable scientists with other really good ideas to potentially risk mitigate and not be wrong because they join us. And so, you go from 18MC, which is a derivative plant, to over to LSD, and you start getting into these things because what investors want is that you build a portfolio potentially using common services, whether it's certain clinical trial development tools, labs preparatory steps, all the way down to finance and approvals and FDA interaction, et cetera. Because we get really good at interacting with the FDA for one thing, guess what? You're good at interacting with the FDA. And so I would say that the sophisticated investors are looking at the probability that you're not wrong on everything you're doing. And the probability of not being wrong on everything you're doing improves with each new thing you add to the portfolio. So I do find that has been a primary advantage that we're developing, at least in MindMed. I would say in Red Light Holland, the question is adoption rate in jurisdictions where it's not illegal, right? Like what is going to happen in the Netherlands versus Jamaica versus Brazil versus every other evolving area? And so that really is a question of how many areas, how many people, and then is there an audience that, I think stereotypically, and I know they're not real great things to use, but stereotypes sometimes are time savers. Like, what was the market in the Netherlands for psilocybin shrooms? It was so that perhaps somebody leaving the US at the age of 22 years of age could arrive in the Netherlands and spend 3 days mostly destroyed. I think there's a window and an opportunity to do a great job of actually having microdosing available to feed into the discussions that have already been put forward, and that there are a number of people who would like to have a reliable option that's the same every time, that is properly prepared, presented, and branded, so they can actually microdose for their own reason and do it confidently. And that is an income stream that falls as legality and trust. So I think that investors in each thesis have to have a theory on how they go forward. But I found the portfolio thing to be actually a critical path item for large investors.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Sorry, Mac. Bruce, can I ask, like, how many entrepreneurs come, with a strategy for managing downside? Like, because as surely as an entrepreneur, you are not this. You don't talk really. You don't want to talk that much to investors about downside. So, how do they manage that conversation?
Well, I'm smiling because on the first 3 or 4 raises I did for Tweed, I had a slide in it, and it had an image of a tomato with a little green on the top, and there's a bit of a sparkle on the corner of the tomato. It was one of the better looking tomatoes I've ever seen. And I had that at about my 6th slide, because my plan was people would give me whacks of money so I could build a facility without a license to use it. And then a bureaucrat from a government would come by with a clipboard and say, pass or fail, after I spent $15 million. And I would have this super secure environment with the most crazy ass amount of filters to take any scent out of the whole place and everything. And so I'd explain to the people who were obviously thinking, what if he fails? And so I explained to them that what I was going to, my plan B, my downside protection, is I was going to grow tomatoes. And as long as I could sell them for $100 each, I think over a reasonably long period of time, I could recover their cash. And I had to put that in there so I could lead to the actual discussion of downside protection, which was, this was not at that time about growing marijuana. What it was about was achieving a mandate that the leader of a country personally believed in. which was he wanted the cops to be happy because he wanted regulated cannabis meant he needed to have factories approved. And here's my team, and this is why I think we'll win one. But I do think you have to set up a bridge to a discussion about the what if I fail. And you should
you never see that in promotional marketing anyway.
Well, you know what, though? I got 16 rounds of financing, about $6 billion. I think it works. So it's always important to tackle what's in their mind they're reluctant to express. And it is, there's nobody with money. There's nobody with money that doesn't think about downside protection, because you know what they end up? They have no money if they don't think that way. You got to think both ways.
One comment I'll make quickly, Bruce, I think your candor, is again, coming from your seat and the position of what you're doing at MindMed. I've got high level clinicals I'm going after an IP on one side, and I'm threading the needle through a loophole. Don't worry about the feds on the other side. I think in a quintessence, that is a representation of this risk and opportunity matrix that investors are considering, right? How am I going to bet my dollars? Large institutions that see Mount Sinai and other, good research, they feel comfortable. Like Haim called out, supply chains are built, right? We don't actually have to go deploy tons of CapEx. So you might be able to secure longer legacy, more blue chip type of capital, and then balance that, as you said, growing this portfolio into higher risk near-term returns. It's compelling, and it's different than cannabis, which should be highlighted, as Ann mentioned.
And honestly, a picture of a gorgeous tomato always causes, what the frick is that in your deck for? And so it is a point to pause, to disarm the topic and have the discussion. And I think we all have to talk about it, honestly. Like, I love some of the retreat strategies. I love them. I love some of the clinical strategies. So the downside on having a bunch of real estate clinics is, what else can you do in there in case the revenue streams don't happen in a reasonable time frame? Okay, here's what we'd add to it. But that conversation has to happen, I think, to get durable funding.
Let's talk a little bit about responsibility and stigma. As Anna, you pointed out, and we've kind of continued to unpack here. We smoke weed, we're going to get high, right? You have THC has a euphoric effect, and we can use a bunch of other language. You take MDMA, you're having a different experience than if you take ketamine. Let's put it that way. And these experiences are in micro and macro dose. Many that would go into your endocannabinoid system or look at the actual physiological effects could show them completely different. How do we get investor communities comfortable? How do we see this level of comfort? What responsibilities do these companies have that are playing in the therapeutic space around non-regulated dosing? I would just, anybody that wants to pick up that type of topic for conversation, I think it would only do justice to the panel and the group that's listening. So responsibility, stigmas in the industry, modalities to market. What do you think? Some that have merit, some that are fringe, any hurdles or roadblocks you might see for any specific development of any type of product or business?
I'm happy to start that dialogue. I think we have a unique opportunity, and we've seen it over the past few years, that is typically rare. The institutions, the family offices, and kind of the larger investment managers, they can't get in, at the bottom ground of some of these opportunities. This has been a real opportunity for a retail investor, which is pretty unique. And there really was this driving force to the managed money side of things, and for people to go into pools of funds. And really, it was a unique opportunity for somebody that isn't, a money manager, to be able to participate in some incredible upside in a market. And I spent a lot of time in the US over the past few years, speaking with family offices, and there's so much capital on the sidelines. They're dying to jump in. They just didn't have it built into their mandate to be able to do so at that time. Companies had to get to a certain level. I think Bruce got to experience that probably differently than some of the other companies in the space, because you really had to be at a certain level for some of that, big capital to be able to come in. We're seeing it again in psychedelics. Now, psychedelics might be a little bit different, only because there's going to be so much R&D element to it. But I think the one thing that's really important for people to remember is that, as Bruce said, the apple on his deck, replace psychedelic with, anything. what is the business model? Do they intend on revenue generating? Are they doing R&D? How long is that R&D going to take? How much capital do they need to do that? As an investor coming in at 25 cents, you have to still go and raise this much money. What does this look like for me as a partner? I encourage people when they're shareholders to look at themselves as partners in these companies. If you like a company, continue to support them in future rounds and continue to participate. So take away the psychedelic element for a moment and take a look at these companies as companies. The second part of that, and this is the interesting part, is that the market is just insanely in love with the sector. So there's that element as well. Usually you have to be a bit more sophisticated and probably have a bigger network within the capital markets to know when some of these companies are going to do well just based on secondary market interest. But you really have to look at both of those elements. Oh, so sorry, responsibility. I think I went on a tangent. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, but everybody's got a checklist, right, guys? It's due diligence. Find the revenue plan. I've got here. Use of proceeds. How are we going to spend our money? Do we have enough money? Right? Capital formations, and then taking the rose-colored lens, or I guess the Cheshire-colored lenses off, and saying, what business are they actually in? Anna, that's all meat and potatoes. No one's mad at you. Haim?
I think there is a burden of responsibility for any player in this industry, whether they're looking at recreational use, health and wellness use, or the prescriptive medical use for mental illness. PsyTech happens to play under its brand Tovana in the latter. So we're looking at the mainstreaming of the therapies that are being canonized right now through the research taking place around the world. So ketamine's out there now. It's a matter of time before it gets coded by insurance companies. There is a responsibility for the companies that are engaged in this and for the healthcare providers themselves to do the proper screening. Ketamine's not like psilocybin, in which there is no lethal dose. You 100% can kill somebody with ketamine. There's people who should not take it. So proper screening is one example, physiological and psychiatric, which means, and by the way, the same is true for other psychedelics as well. Not all of them are as danger-free as psilocybin seems to be from a toxicology point of view. So wherever these therapies are being done, proper clinical care should be taken, both in screening, during a session, and equally as importantly, the integration periods after. So quality of care is an area of responsibility that any company that's engaged in macro dosing of anything should be awake to. Which, by the way, is another reason, I'll pivot off that for a moment. Anne went off the question. I'm allowed to too, Matt. I'm
no, come on, you get
1 second. Thank you, Anne. Data. I just want to say we can't end this conversation without mentioning data. There was so much conversation around the therapies and the molecules and the supply chains themselves, but this is an area where there is a richness of data that has yet to be captured, is barely being tapped into. There's so much going on out there, both clinical research and just farming the uses of psychedelics that are taking place in retreat centers, in people's personal lives. 1 is an anecdote, 100 is an anecdote, 10,000 is statistically significant data that should be captured and used. And then on top of that, you have all the formally captured data taking place and all the clinical studies, both in the university hospitals and those being run by private companies. And that's what's going to drive all that data capture and analysis. The tools that are being used, I think that's a great area to invest in, by the way. All that is going to lead to best practices. And whenever you have an emerging therapeutic in a clinical setting, you're going to need to have best practices canonized and continuously updated. it's one of the it's why I took PsyTech into that space. I think it's needed, and I think it's going to drive patient safety.
Hi, awesome, man. Yeah, safety, consistency for dosage, value creation for the companies that participate in it, and like you and Anna are both saying, this is, we can't have a bathtub full of acid again, right? I mean, I guess someone can have one. It's a free world, so I'm not someone, but we can't have those be the headlines again. These things aren't you just smoke enough cannabis and you go to sleep. There are real ramifications, and I think that there's an interesting parallel there on responsibility and value of companies that are going to be following higher quality procedures to protect that downside risk exposure that Bruce is talking about. Stephen, responsibilities in the market, stigmatization of psychedelics. Just your thoughts of the segment and how it's going to be received overall.
Sure. To kick off on responsibilities, I think there's a lot of responsibility on the entrepreneur and the companies in terms of what capital they take in and where they take it in from. I think we've seen obviously the rise of impact investment, and that's very interesting because it challenges for a higher purpose of the company that it invests in, and looking to make a change for global good. So I think investors, should, or be it entrepreneurs or companies, should be, willing to be challenged by investors who want to hold them to the highest standards. And with an early stage industry, well, somewhat early stage industry, dealing, as Haim said, in a pretty serious side of the market when you're dealing with healthcare. Not only do you have to ensure that the highest standards, but it's important that any capital that is going on to develop this access and develop this portal is really, is aware of the standards required and is pushing their capital to meet those standards. So I think it kind of starts back earlier, maybe in the investor change, and going back and saying, okay, who's on my cap table, and is providing more than just capital, because that will ultimately build a better company and a better patient experience. Regarding the stigma, I think where it's conversations like these, it's conversations in the media. It was simple things back in the day of not having a teenager in the park smoking a joint as the main image on the newspaper when the word cannabis or marijuana was mentioned, but it was a patient in hospital, or a child and their mother. And I think that type of media perception is changing substantially, and I think the term psychedelics, as we break it into be it MDMA or ketamine, it's hard to paint it all with the one brush. There's of course the challenge with it is there is quite a high adult use market, and that exists globally, and that's not going to go away. People want to enjoy these experiences, and unfortunately, you're going to have tragedies that take place because there isn't a legal and a responsible path to market for consumers by regulators. But you've got to make the communication as medically focused in the short term as possible to differentiate and to showcase, that this is a patient first kind of perspective that we're trialing now. Of course, there's health and wellness and that there's other sectors, but the more you can specialize or focus the conversation you're having will, of course, destigmatize psychedelics and make people more comfortable. Like my mom now talks about MDMA and ketamine. Now, that wouldn't happen. But she's a counselor, and she's asking, about she's new therapies, and that's suddenly cropped up in their circle. And that wouldn't happen 2-3 years ago, but because you've got people talking about it from a medical perspective, it's fascinating.
That's precisely. Yeah, thank you, Matt. That's precisely why the only crystal ball prediction I will make, besides we firmly believe in the incredible therapeutic power of psychedelics, is that succession, for the reason you just stated. It'll start with the therapeutic uses, because these are by nature recreational drugs as well. It's also why the data matters. Destigmatification is happening really fast, and certainly credit goes to cannabis for that. Credit goes to the vets and to patients and other advocacy groups. But it's the clinical data that I think is driving this industry, and what we're really asking the medical community to do. It's not about opinion anymore. We're asking them to honor their adherence to the scientific method. That's it. If you believe we have a huge problem and we have a solution, and the solution is being proven to be incredibly effective in well done clinical studies, that's what you have to honor. And from what I'm seeing in my travels, I'm here in the Middle East. I just came back from the United States, Canada, is that the medical community, I'm delighted to see, is acknowledging. I think it's partially driven by the inability of current mental health therapies to meet the egregious demand because of the epidemic of mental health crises. But I'm not seeing nearly as much stigma as I thought I would when I first got into this a couple of years ago. And that's to the medical community's credit and the good research that's been done.
Well, but you think of this.
Bruce,
The Wall Street Journal has a reporter whose job is to cover this space. So I think it's doctored.
That says a lot.
But when you got the Wall Street Journal having a reporter dedicated or principally dedicated as a lead person on this, that means it's coming from both sides of the street. And maybe my wrap-up comment
Damn right.
that when we have those conversations, I do like things like using phraseology like psychedelic inspired medicines, because it leaves a lot of wiggle room for all of us. And none of us should corner the conversation. It's about creating enough wiggle room so that we can all move forward with our best efforts and not have to combat each other, but complement.
It's a wonderful note to end on.
Bruce, Anna, Haim, Stephen, thank you all so much for letting me moderate this panel. I think that this space that PsyTech's created, Deb, you and your team have built here, is so important in this industry. For those investors that have been in cannabis and those just entering this space, there's been a legacy now of getting into the trenches, rolling up your sleeves, investing and betting alongside other investors, learning what works, learning what doesn't work, whether there's the juice meets the squeeze, and working in an environment where there's actually not landscape, right? There's no roads out there. What Bruce is doing, what Haim's doing, they're paving the road ahead of the opportunities that they're building. And as you heard, there's huge opportunity. Unlike cannabis and hemp, you have major institutions. You have health and well-being needs. You see the VA and Veterans Affairs deployment of capital. There's even a journalist at the Wall Street Journal covering psychedelics. It's a really exciting time to be here. PsyTech, Deb, thank you so much for letting me moderate this great panel.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Matt, for moderating it beautifully. And for Anna, Stephen, Bruce, of course, Haim, our CEO of PsyTech. It was just really exciting to have you on. And I think everyone just has a lot of takeaways from this, that no one has left this entire roundtable, the entire event, because no one wanted to miss anything. And I think there'll be a lot of tomatoes in people's investor decks from now on. Is that people are going to be like, what the hell's going on? So thank you,
Bruce, you just affected tomato futures.
Correct. I also just want to, sorry, Bruce?
Make sure it's like one of those that it's just so beautiful, because you're going to have it there for at least 3 minutes with the investor. They're going to be like looking at it. So it should just be spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, think about the vegetables so no one thinks you're copying Bruce. Like go crazy, you know.
Yeah,
But,
get Bruce's email. Get Bruce's email and put it out. If for some reason an investor doesn't fund the tomato presentation, it's got to go to his desk.
100%. But I just want to add to what everyone's mentioned, and it has to do with what PsyTech's project of education that we're running at the moment, which is if you want to invest, you have to learn about the space. There is endless amount of information. This has been started centuries ago. This has come from the indigenous. This has come from the scientists that are researching it now. So please feel free to look up our education course, and we're offering a 50% discount after New Year's. So feel free to sign up and learn about what's going on in the space. And I want to wish everyone Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I hope we have a healthier New Year and a more exciting one and encouraging. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you at the next roundtable.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Deb.
Guys.
Thanks, everybody.